All right, so tell me, if you don't mind, tell me a little bit about yourself, sir.
All right.
Like,
Ready?
yeah, let me turn this light on too. Hold on.
Right.
I'll like edit all this part out. It's lighting. Okay. Okay. Give me 1 second. Should be better now. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. My name is Dr. Tommy Curry. I'm a full professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University, the author of The Man Not, one of the originators of Black Male Studies. And generally, I work on black men, how we study black men, and issues of sexual violence and sexual trauma amongst black men, brown men, and other racially oppressed populations.
Okay. I'm just gonna ask you a couple quick questions. It won't be too long because I don't want to take too much of your time.
No problem.
In your opinion, because I know I've always paid attention to your posts, as I said on social media, and I know some people can't necessarily handle that truth based on your research, and you get some backlash sometime, even if the data and the statistics is right there in their face. Uh, would you say that feminism has contributed to the destruction of the black family?
Well, I think that's a complicated question because I think we should be very careful in how we talk about feminism. So, if we're talking about white feminism as it evolves from the 19th century forward, right, starting with white suffragists and their claims about the need of women to get the right to vote and black men being dangerous, savage, etc., I'd say absolutely because the theories that are being used by white feminists from 1860 to the 1950s all suggest that the black family is pathological, that black men are savages, that black men are deserters, that black men are violent, and that black men are misogynist. And that's something that we could find, in the early speeches in the history of suffrage, when white women like Phoebe Cousins are talking about black men being brutish, or when you have people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony suggesting that to limit the number of black, brown, Asian men that come into the United States because they have no respect for womanhood and are rapists. Those stereotypes carry a lot of force because even in the early 1900s to early 20th century, these are the same stereotypes that social scientists are using to talk about and describe black men in relationship to black women and black families. And you can see evidence of this well into the 1960s as well. So I would say yes, that white feminism has certainly been a destructive force. If we're talking about black feminism that's coming about in the late 70s to early to mid 80s, then I think that you're looking at in some cases an extension of that logic. So if you're reading someone like Bell Hooks, where she argues that black men were taught through slavery not to care about their children, then that's an extension, right, of the logic that you see with white feminism. But if you're reading somebody like Gloria Joseph or the early Angela Davis, there were certainly people who identify or would identify now as black feminists that wouldn't agree with that. So I think that what you see in black feminism, or even the debates between black feminists and black womanists, is that there's a suspicion that some black feminism carries on some of the racist tropes that white feminism laid out. But then again, when we look at some of the womanists or black radical thinkers like Joyce Ladner or LaFrancis Rogers Rose, they're very much doing a black family study that contradicts that.
Right.
So black feminism, I think you have two trajectories, right? With white feminism, I think the answer is overwhelmingly yes. There hasn't been any analysis that comes out of white feminism that's ever looked at black men as human. They've primarily been savage, rapists, and misogynistic.
Exactly. Exactly. Totally agree based on the research I've done and read as well. Would you say that because I don't I mean I've seen you touch on this topic a little bit so and I always wanted to ask you this. Would you say that feminism is an extension of white supremacy?
Oh, absolutely. If we're talking about the ways that white supremacy developed, like the idea of white patriarchy, then when you're looking at feminism and how white women envision feminism, right? that feminism is going to be a leg of white supremacy. And what I find to be so dishonest about how we look at that or engage that argument contemporarily is we'll say something like, "Oh, well, white feminists were racist because they're women of their time," but that's not the case. The argument was feminism came about to complete the development of patriarchy. So when you look at the work of Louise Newman, when you look at the work of Alice Snyder, right? When you just actually, if you just go back and read the testaments of white suffragists in the Revolution, it's very clear that their argument is that you need a dominant imperial female force to accompany a dominant white male force. Was white men rule by destruction? White women calm the destructive impulse and colonize. Right? They're able to bring in, for example, the Bible, democracy, ideas. So the argument was to perfect the white race's dominance around the world. That dominance needed a female force to counterbalance the male force. And this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? Writing this stuff. So yeah, so there's not a debate historically about whether or not feminism started off as white supremacy. If you fast forward to the 1900s, then, like, I've said tons of times in lots of different interviews, then you see nothing but white women celebrating white supremacy. So WKKK, the Citizen Councils, all the activism of white women. Gillespie just wrote a book on this. All the activism of white women was fundamentally dedicated to making sure black men did not interact with white women because their job was to protect white society and the white family, which they believed was the basis for it. So if you're talking about the history of feminism in that, based on its actual history, then these are not just opinions. These are organized structures, political organizations, a full buy-in of white women into ethno-nationalism, which is why one of the people that first started supporting women's rights to vote were the Klan. These are very well documented things that's not hard for anybody to find. But we often retreat from evidence because we built feminism as a kind of moral intuitionism in the society. So it's not very different than democracy. When critical race theorists start attacking democracy and attacking the civil rights movement, they called them terrorists, they called them names, etc. Right? It's the same kind of thing. So you have a black man that comes up and says, let's start interrogating the history of feminism and its relationship to black and colonized people, and they say the same thing. You're a misogynist, you're
Right.
this, you're that. This stuff is not new. Anytime someone comes up with a new criticism, you have people slandering their character and slandering them personally. But the question is, do the facts demonstrate the case? It's not like I have to make something up here. I'm just looking in the archives and saying, what are these white women saying? And what are these bourgeois black women who started black feminism saying? Right? Is there a leg that cares about the violence that black women are suffering, the violence in our communities? Absolutely. But there's also a leg that takes on and demonizes black men the same way that white feminists do.
Right.
That wants to rise within the capitalistic structure and thinks that black men impede that. So we have to be very careful about what we're talking about, right?
With there being so many negative stereotypes in the world, not just in America, and I say world because I'm a world traveler. I've lived in 7 countries. I've visited over 25 countries, and obviously I'm living in Poland right now and having this interview with you. With all the negative stereotypes about black men in the world, um, what would you? Let me rephrase this question. What would you say would be some ways that black men could combat fatherlessness, and what do you think contributes to fatherlessness? Do you think it's just a generational thing, whereas if a black male grows up without a father, he's more than likely to make babies and not be a father to his children? Like, what would
Mm-hmm.
you say based on everything that you're
Well,
accustomed to?
well, I mean, look, I think there's a difference between how we perceive black fatherlessness and the realities of black fathers, right? Let's see what I mean by that. We have to start off with the institutional problems of black male expendability, homicide, and death, because that's what's flipping the sex ratios, such that black women generally outnumber black men. Incarceration, death, suicide, etc. The second thing is we have to then look at, well, the black men who do survive, that are not incarcerated or institutionalized, how do we see their life chances and quality of life? And then you get into questions of poverty, underemployment, unemployment, right? Because most of the research suggests that that's one of the main factors in marriages and whether or not marriage is sustained, whether or not men feel that there's an economic benefit or economic sustenance in the marital relationship. And then lastly, we have to start looking at individual trauma. So what are the experiences of these men in these relationships? Were they victims of domestic abuse, child sexual abuse? Did they have fathers? These types of things. And I think that when you look across the board, because you find that black men generally are good fathers in environments where they're able to be fathers. And then you see that other black men, like if black men are outside are taken away from a family, either through death or incarceration or something, other black men step up in roles as social fathers, right? Siri McDougal does great work on this. So I would say that fatherlessness then clearly isn't demonstrated by a lack of will, because you have so many indicators that suggest that black men are involved in children's lives, even when those children are not theirs. So then we have to say, well, then what are the institutional barriers that are preventing black men from being able to always be present with their children, right? And I think that's where the rubber meets the road, because you're losing black men from 15 to 34, which are the prime ages of both pairing and being able to provide for families. Also, the prime time where people accumulate wealth in this country. So given that, I think the question becomes, why do we think of fatherlessness as a particular pathology of black men, right? Why do we associate black men with not being good fathers? And I think that comes from the racist tropes of the turn of the century. And this is what I meant when I said earlier that I think a lot of the feminism, including some black feminism, just reproduces that argument, right? It doesn't break with the mark of oppression that black men can't be fathers because they're not good patriarchs. It doesn't break with the arguments that black men desert their family ways that, right? This is some of Bell Hook's early work. So in order for us to refute this, we have to look at the data. That's the first thing, right? And then we have to do something that many people don't want to do. We actually have to go out and study black men, because what we usually do is we study black women's experiences of black men. We have very little accounts of how black men actually feel about fathering, how black men actually perceive fathering. What are the obstacles that black men understand to be, part and parcel of how they get to be good parents? These are things that we haven't approached yet in any significant form. And I think that's the only way we're going to get to the problem.
Mm-hmm. Wow, deep. That's a very interesting and deep analysis. Gives me a little bit more things to read and research. So thank you for that. Another question I have.
Sure.
Would you say, based on the laws and based on everything that society is like preaching nowadays, would you say that getting married, from a legal standpoint, is a disadvantage for men? With the implications with the implications of like divorce, etc., and all that stuff. Because obviously that can contribute to fatherlessness as well, too, right?
Absolutely. I think it's a disadvantage to black men in terms of divorce and childcare because of their economic position, right? So there's a few studies that are talking about the disproportionate burden of childcare and alimony, things of that sort for black men, because they aren't, the level of job discrimination and economic discrimination they suffer compared to whites is just so enormous that it doesn't accumulate wealth. It's not like you're taking half of wealth; you're basically taking half of sustenance. So I think that is a problem. In terms of the actual marriage arrangement, assuming it doesn't end in divorce, I don't know if that's necessarily bad. Patricia Hill Collins wrote this article a while back on the political economy of the black family, and one of the things she was saying is that without marriage, she's focusing on black women, saying black women don't accumulate wealth, but marriages, that's how wealth is accumulated within any group of people, any race, United States or abroad, because that allows people to transfer resources intergenerationally. I think with black men, there's such a problem because the lack of our social mobility means that we can't accumulate wealth as quickly as whites, or if all, at all. If you're looking at some of the work that Darity and Antonio Moore are talking about, so maybe economic, but the other part about that too is there's so many tremendous mental and psychological and cultural benefits for marriages, that I think that has to be taken into account as well. Black men and black women, as much as the social media and the white pundits and feminist pundits want to suggest actually do like each other in the majority. You have 83% of black men who make over $100,000 marrying black women, and you have, I think it's like 88% of men in general marrying black women. So there's something to be said
this is from
about
an American standpoint, correct?
American, yeah. So American standpoint, yeah, American data. But I mean, given that, there seems to be this attraction that black men have to black women and vice versa. And if that's the case, at least socially, then we would assume that there has to be some kind of psychological or cultural benefit to black people being with each other. And I think that can't be understated.
Okay. From back to something you stated earlier, as far as like black feminism is concerned, would you say that black feminism sort of pits the man against the woman, the black man against the black woman?
I think some variations.
And they try to usher in that I don't need no man type of thing, ideal, that whole BS that they preaching.
I think some black feminism does. I think that that's what you get when you turn on social media or Twitter.
Right.
People champion intersectionality and black feminism as a hyper individualistic, hyper capitalist view of black women. But I think that some of the black feminist literature, excluding Bell Hooks, but even, she wavers on this because she takes such a heavy hand in naming everything patriarchal that nobody pays attention to the dysfunction of women within families or communities. And even though she mentions it, nobody ever studies that. So then the effect of that is like you're basically targeting black men. And the problem is, well, black men are perpetrators, black men are violent, black men are abusers, black men are rapists. And that's just not the context of our society, of our communities, right? So I think that black feminism plays a role in misframing a lot of the problems that we have in our community. But again, I'm saying that with nuance because there are black feminists who I read, like Wisdom. They're mostly social science. Wisdom Powell's work, Evelyn Simeon's work. I actually like a lot of Patricia O'Collins's work, and I think that they're much more careful on some of these points. The problem, however, is that when the careful black feminist literature, like the actual text and research, doesn't respond to this other variant of black feminism and is allowed to characterize black men, then all of black feminism looks like it's anti-black men, right?
Right.
And I don't know if that's the case, right? I honestly don't. I argue with people. I try to tell people this all the time. Is that my criticism of black feminism is how black feminism is utilized to demonize black men in line with white supremacist tropes.
Thank you.
But there are black. Yeah. So I think that black men have been saying that for a long time. That there are variants of black feminism where it implicates black men in violence and rape, etc. That you can't, like, if you put the two statements side by side, you can't tell if it's a white supremacist writing in the 1940s or it's a black feminist writing today. So I think that is a problem. Does that mean that all black feminism does that, or all black feminism is bad? Not so much, because the argument is not that black feminism can't contribute to the understanding of women or problems in our community. The issue is that the theories that they've utilized in many cases to do that by describing black men have been inadequate, racist, misandric, etc. So yeah, I think it's half and half. I think the larger problem is that black feminism as a whole misses female violence and female perpetration of violence. It doesn't want to talk about black women who abuse their husbands. It does not want to talk about black women who abuse their children. It does not want to talk about black women with mental health issues who are antisocial. And these are things that black men and other women in our communities have to deal with. So there's a lack of empiricism because it's geared to how we express the vulnerability, right, and the victimization of black women, which is certainly a thing, right? We look at data, we do see disproportionate violence against women. The problem is we see the same kinds of disproportionate violence against men, black men in our community, some by women, some by other men. And I think that's what's kind of lacking, right? So when we talk about black feminism and its relationship to the black family, black community, we have to hold it like any other theoretical paradigm next to evidence. And I don't think we do that. Which is why you have all these black men saying, well, you're saying black men are trash. You're saying black men abuse and kill women. You say black men abuse children. When in reality, the data suggests something vastly different, that black men who are in the household with their own child actually deters child abuse, right? That black men actually take lots of time with their children. right? That rates of domestic violence at the hands of men or male to female domestic violence actually decreased. The highest increases are female to male and bidirectional violence, right? So these are social scientific questions that we need social workers, sociologists, et cetera, to dig into. And right now, Black feminism acts like anyone who questions it, anyone who tries to actually empirically investigate these phenomena in Black families and in Black relationships are in fact misogynistic. So it calls for a kind of ideological censorship or paradigmatic censorship in terms of how we investigate Black life. And I think that that's the biggest problem. Not so much whether or not it's purely anti-male or purely anti-Black. I think that it obscures asking questions from a different point of view because it's overly moralized in many cases.
Yeah, I would love to see you at a feminist debate on that topic, like an actual debate, not where people use ad hominem and cognitive dissonance and things like that, where they actually debate you fair and square, back and forth.
Well, yeah, I don't think, but again, I don't think that that's part of the performance of how we do gender, right? I mean, the performance of gender in the United States is like, oh, a man's talking to me, he's mansplaining, he's this and that, and Black men are the minority in the academy. Compared to women. So I don't understand the power dynamics, right? To say that Black men can't question theories about themselves, but every other group can, seems to me to be a basis of, part of an indication of dehumanization, rather than an indication or indicator of power. And I think that what we've done is we've become so enmeshed in rhetoric around gender and intersectionality that nobody can just answer straight up questions.
Right.
Right. Like because my work is Black male studies is positing a question: if Black men are patriarchal, why do all the indicators of patriarchy show that they're not?
Right.
Right. If Black men have economic privilege, then why are Black men falling behind their female counterpart in education and social mobility?
Right.
Why do they have downward mobility? Right. Like these are basic questions that you would expect any scholar to ask / be able to answer. And then when they're positive with Black men at the center, right, are looking at rates of child sexual abuse, which is what we just completed a study on, or looking at child physical abuse, or even looking at same-sex abuse, right, men abusing men, young boys. Why are these questions out of bounds? And why does everything about Black people have to be reduced down to patriarchy? Right? White people don't study white people that way. Right? When white people look at, what's causing domestic abuse, they go back to experiences in childhood.
Right.
Like Linda Mills' work, right? Or Denise Hines' work looking at intimate terrorism. They're saying, well, look, women are abusing the hell out of men. But Black men can't even ask the question. So if I ask the question, why are Black women abusing men? Oh, it's all for self-defense. All 1.47 million cases is self-defense.
Right.
And they're like, yeah. So it's like, so what you're basically telling, and this is how flawed. I think this indicates just how debased and dehumanized Black men are. So when you're comparing 12-month prevalences, this is just CDC numbers, right? And you say, okay, there's 1.37 million women that are going to experience domestic violence at the hand of an entity. That's all men, even though that number's not all men. Then you go to the men, 100,000 or 1,200,000 more. It's almost 1.5 million. And you'd say, well, look, the 12-month prevalence that are self-reported by men is higher. And they say, oh, well, that's because they're all abusers. So basically what people are telling you is like, you're not looking at any male victims. You're just looking at double the male abusers, right? Because even when Black men say we're being victimized, we're being abused, you say, no, you're really a perpetrator.
Right.
Right? That kind of logic has to stop. All the evidence we have, and this evidence is accumulated mostly by looking at white cohorts, suggests that women have very similar motivations for abuse as men do: control, previous trauma, and different kind of forms of anxiety, right? Or mental dysfunction.
Right.
All these things match up with female abusers. When you look at sexual offenders, so female sexual offenders, you see the same kind of motivations. So my question again becomes, why is it that the literature and empiricism of studying these groups say one thing, and then feminist or Black feminist theory says another? And even if those two things disagree, why is it that it's somehow the job of Black male scholars who want to study their own victimization to naturally have to side with feminism? Why can't I side with family conflict studies? Why can't I side with ecological theories of domestic violence? Right? If Black feminists want to have their theory, God bless them. But that does not mean that Black men who disagree with that theory cannot test other ways to get to the same problem. And I guess what I get most upset about is everybody who's serious about studying this admits that women are victims of domestic violence. That's not an aha moment, right? You see the data, you see you're socialized into that. But when you say, well, then what's the relationship of these kinds of violences amongst black people? Suddenly everybody gets sensitive. Well, you can't ask why women are beating children. You can't ask why women disproportionately neglect male black boys or black male children. Right? You can't ask why these black women are abusing black men both in marriages and on dating. So we rarely talk about dating violence, but black men disproportionately are victims of dating violence, right? So why is it that we have evidence for all these things, but black men can't ask the question of why?
Right.
You know, and I think that that's what a black male studies and a serious investigation, or even challenge to black feminism should do. It's not dismissing it, but it's saying, do your theories actually apply given the weight of empirical evidence that we have to the contrary?
I know that's right. Wow. Yeah, definitely some eye openers for people out there that really aren't up to date or educated necessarily in the field on that, and they get most of their information from mainstream media, and to me that's just a narrative that people are pushing, and it's that narrative has been pushed not only in academia, but like I say, mainstream media, music, etc.
Yeah.
And you have all these people in positions of power that are influencing billions of people across the globe, and it's like, the everyday man, when we, traveling and stuff like that throughout the world, wherever we may be, we get judged accordingly,
Of course.
by these unspoken rules, and obviously, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, within the black male construct, within the black community, we would be considered the 1%. Yourself, based on our accomplishments and based on our educational level, we would be considered the 1% of black male. And I'm very aware of that, because I used to think that when I would see certain issues happening throughout the world, I would think, oh, so and so, he's innocent. This is, I mean, not everybody's innocent, but not everybody's guilty, right? But at the same time, right? But at the same time, I'm looking at it from this standpoint. I'm just like, you know what? A lot of these guys, from a black male point of view, they're so influenced by negativity, because I'm a firm believer in the exchange of energy. Like we can absorb other people's energy, etc. And like you said, based on the studies, if a black male is growing up in an unhealthy home environment with a single black woman, which apparently, the studies say that that's the case the majority of the time. I think what is 85% of in the black
some of them as far as 85%. I think some of the more realistic ones are around 40, 50, about half.
Okay, about half. Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to grow up with my father personally, me personally. But I would say that influences a black boy before he becomes a man, because
absolutely.
He doesn't know how to be a man by the time he gets older, right? So who has raised him? Maybe his uncles that were not raised by fathers. Maybe he grew up by rappers and rap music, and nowadays it's absolutely trash compared to I grew up in the '90s with Pac and Big.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
See, so I was born in the late '80s, grew up in the '90s, so I'm just like I grew up in the golden age of hip hop, and what they rapping about nowadays, man, and I feel sorry for the kids that are actually looking to these guys for guidance, because obviously you have a lot of these kids looking to these dudes for guidance, and they telling them to do drugs, and some of them rape girls and all this other crazy. It's like the ones that are in control, even at the record labels, they're perpetuating ignorance. They're putting it on the radio stations. They're putting it on television. And this ignorance is spreading like it's already here. It's spread like a wildfire. It's like a virus, right?
It does.
And
I think. I'm sorry. I didn't hear that.
Well, I was gonna finish up and then let you go. It's like a virus, and it's like that virus. The cure. The Tommy. You myself, for a couple other educated brothers would be the cure to that virus, but we're fighting. Obviously, overall it's a war. But we're fighting little individual battles, and it's like to see we're highly outnumbered. We're greatly outnumbered, and it's like sometimes I wake up and I'm like, man, like what am I fighting? What the I ain't gonna say the word, but what the am I fighting for? You know what I mean? And then I'm just like, you know what? I gotta just keep going. I gotta keep going, because it's hard because it's like you'll have black women attack you. You'll have the whites attack you. You'll have even have other black males attack you. And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
what is it? What is it? There's something going on that people are afraid of
Oh
that
yeah.
you're out to protect to the point to where you're upset that I'm questioning why.
Right. Right. And that's the thing. I mean, when has that not been the case in history? Right. I mean, think about it. I mean, this is what I tell people is that black men, and I write about this in my book, is that black men have always been the least liked, least respected, and least believed throughout history. It's not like when Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King or X. I mean, these men died because of their ideas. And I think that one of the ways, that we dishonor them is that people constantly decontextualize their lives.
Right.
So, we got black feminists now like, oh, well, these men were all about patriarchy. Patriarchy as a word didn't even exist. When people like Du Bois and Douglas and,
Booker
many of
T
the
was
black men,
around.
Booker T. Washington, Charles Johnson, Farrah. Like, it wasn't even a word because evolutionarily speaking, the understanding was that black people were not a patriarchal race. So there was no patriarchs in the race. And then we come back and we frame all this stuff as they all just wanted power to dominate women. And there's no evidence of that. Like, I mean, there literally is no evidence. Like, all the people who make that argument in academia cite bell hooks. Like, that's it. I mean, I've traced out all these citations because I'm like, where are you getting this stuff from? And they're all just citing bell hooks from. So I think that when we talk about who we're fighting against, this war, we have to understand that it's a deliberate misrepresentation of black life first, and specifically a targeting of black male life.
Right.
Because what we're ultimately showing, or what people ultimately are invested in, is this idea of black men as patriarchs, which is really a code for black men are violent. Because we know that black men have no power. Like nobody dares to black men own militaries, etc. So they really use that word to say, well, look, ultimately black men are violent. They abuse women, they abuse children, and they're rapists.
Right.
And I think that when we get past the rhetoric of patriarchy to the substance of what they mean by that category, then what we're dealing with are people who have internalized a form of male scholars called anti-black misandry. There's a hatred of black men, specifically lower class black men. And then there's the attempt to represent all black men as if they're lower class black men.
Right.
So despite the education level of black men generally, there's an assumption that black men are just like their lower class counterparts because that's where you find the rape, the homicide, and the violence. But then again, this is what a black male studies scholar would do. Is they say, well, let's compare that the rape, the homicide, and the violence to other groups of poor people. Right. Let's compare it to black women in the same condition. And outside of homicide, there is not much difference because you see similar rates of domestic abuse, higher rates of child abuse, higher rates of statutory rape. Right. The only difference that you really see and find is between homicide because men in general kill more strangers than women do. However, the homicide literature is very clear that women are more threatening to intimates. So women usually kill people that they're intimately connected with, children, friends, things of that sort, right? That's just criminological facts. Like, I don't know, like when some people fight and say these things are controversial, I don't know what to say because literally I'm just expressing what the previous literature has said. I think where I depart from that is I'm going to say, well, when you look at black people, why? Why do you see poverty expressing itself in violence in this way? But that's not a question that's vastly different than how people have been studying poor people for the last century. It's just that somehow, because we want to flip everything to race and not see the interactions between racism and poverty, or racism and dehumanization, or racism and depression, anxiety, alcohol dependence, whatever the ecological factor may be, we tend to reduce everything down to, well, only black men are violent, and that violence is patriarchy, despite the fact that we have disproportionate rates of violence throughout our communities, right? So I guess to that, I mean, that's my long way of saying that in fighting this war, one of the reasons I created Black Male Studies was to train scholars about facts. And those facts are not to make black men angels. They're not to make them demon. It's very much in line to make them human. Because what we're talking about are an overwhelming majority of black men who are not killers, who are not rapists, right? And when I say overwhelming majority, I mean we're talking about over 12 million, right? So out of 12.1 million, this is 2014 data. Out of 12.1 adults, right, men over 18, okay, black men over 18, you're talking about 400 that have killed women. You're talking about 5,000 convicted rapists. You're talking about, right? Like that does not, those numbers of perpetrators do not define the other millions of black men who have not committed crimes, who are good fathers, who respect women, who respect families, who respect the laws of society, even though those laws are unjust and fundamentally geared towards their demise. And despite that overwhelming majority, what I constantly find is a focus on the minority. And I'm not talking about like it's 41% to 49%. I'm saying about people who are a millionth of a percentage of the group, and that's what I don't understand. Like, and that is something. That is why I talk about the way that gender theory studies men, because I can't understand for the life of me. Like, when you look at the percentages of women who rape, abuse, etc., they're similar in terms of their proportion. They're going to be under a millionth of the percentage.
Right.
But nobody says, hey, these white women or these women in general are a million percentage of abusers, ex-wife killers or husbands, etc. They say, well, this year 200 black women were killed by their husbands, and only 115 black men were killed by their wives. So the bigger problem is the women being killed by their husbands. Like that's the numbers we're talking. That's how small the numbers we're talking about, right? Like one year 191 black women were killed. The other, and in that same year 130 black men were killed. Oh, that's 60 people more. I was like, I don't know what these people are after. Because out of all that, that's less than 400 deaths by intimate homicide.
Right.
Where black men are roughly a third or 33%, or maybe 40% of those total. So if the argument's going to be there's a 50, 60, 70 person difference, 100 person difference in the number of people killed, we're going to use that small population of people who kill their intimate partners and base theories off of it. I don't know what we're doing. That's not scholarship. That may be your agenda. That may be your ideology. But those 400 people don't represent the 44 or 45 million black people in the country.
Right.
And that's what's upsetting. And I think that a lot of black men have bought into this notion. They've bought into the notion that they're bad because that's what they've been taught. And they move into the academy. And the only thing that gets rewarded in the academy is not black men doing actual work on black males. Because black men are dehumanized. They're basically the scum of the earth, so to speak. Okay. So if you're it becomes an issue. If you're not buying into the pathology, you're outside of the group. And then if you're trying to save the lives of people of black men, who the academy, including black liberals, think are dehumanized, evil, and violent, then people are actually like you're trying to retain evil in them. So there's an idea in the academy that if you're not about the death or the ostracization of black men from institutions, families, or society in general, then you're perpetuating evil. And that's the dehumanized status that black men exist in the world. That if you try to save their lives, that people will come at you because ultimately they don't believe their lives are worth saving.
There you go.
And I think that some of these, radical black feminists, some of these people that constantly write on blogs, they're talking about black men are trash and that black death is karma and we should celebrate black male death, are those types of people. They just believe that black female life is worth more than black male life. So if they're ever in contest, you always pick black women. Mm-hmm. And given the work that I've done with male victims, and like I say, man, like, I exist in a kind of space now where black male victims are constantly, every time I open a Facebook message, somebody's like, thank you for the book. And by the way, I was raped when I was 4. I was raped when I was this, and that. So it's a way, it's a kind of space of existing where I'm constantly hearing stories of victimization.
Right. See,
and to deal with people who don't believe that is just criminal to me.
Right. And to expand on that, on those sentiments a little bit, I tell people all the time the most victimized group in the world, and really you can already say the history of the world, are black men.
Yeah.
And we don't have a support group. That's why I always try to offer a support group to black males, because we don't have that support structure in place. You know what I mean? Like a lot of times we get victimized as black men. We don't have anybody to go talk to. That's why the suicide rate for black men, The suicide rate is
Yeah.
freaking high for black men because we have a lot of shit to, excuse my French, we deal with a lot of shit. We deal with a lot of shit.
Yeah.
And we have no support structure. We have nobody in
I
our
agree.
corner to have our backs. That's why whenever I see a black male and he's making stupid, idiotic decisions, I always try to guide him and say, look, this is what you need to be doing, blah, blah, blah. This is what you need. But I always try to offer my support and guidance because I understand, there's a lot mentally, there's a lot emotionally, there's a lot psychologically that we have to go through. And I'm starting to believe, just based on my studies, I'm starting to believe that traumatic events are actually can be passed down via DNA. I believe that. I don't know.
Yeah, epigenetics. Yeah, I think I think what you're saying is correct. I mean, one of the things that we just finished with this our snapshot study of child sexual abuse is just kind of the effect that sexual abuse or child's physical abuse has on risk taking behavior. So unprotected sex, violence, alcoholism, etc. So I mean, I'm a firm believer that trauma is something that has to be dealt with in our communities, which is why I reject these grand theories of masculinity, which suggest that it's just masculinity that is in itself violent. White people rejected this stuff back in the 80s. I mean, the whole reason you have the term hegemonic masculinity and toxic masculinity is to differentiate that from other forms of masculinity. But for black men, that doesn't work. Like people are so invested in the idea that black men are violent that every black male or black male masculinity is hegemonic and toxic, which is not the case. That's not how the theory was developed. And instead of people being more careful and revising their thinking, you see them doubling down on the fact that all black masculinity is somehow violent. And please understand, this is what I mean when I say it's out of line with the empirical evidence. When you look at same-sex relationships, lesbian and gay, the rates of violence are higher than in heterosexual relationships. And psychologists are talking about that in terms of sexual stigma. That the reason that gay couples abuse more than heterosexual couples is because they have to deal with the added stigma and discrimination from society. Well, then, and again, I've said this before. Well, if that's true, then why can't we see the disproportionate rates of male to female violence in black communities and female to male violence in black communities and bidirectional violence is an effect of that same social stigma? And the reason that we can't is because nobody cares about studying the humanity of black people. So if you have white clinicians, white scientists studying white people, you have all kind of nuanced theories about violence. With black people, first off, you disown female violence. You just place all the negativity on black men, and you say they're the cause for all the violence and corruption in the community, which is just not possible.
Right.
But that's what we say. So in our minds, all robbery, all death, all child abuse, all rape, all sexual coercion, all this comes from black men, and black women are just on the sidelines being victimized over and over again by their sons and their lovers, etc. And this is the narrative that you'll get from people like an Amber Phillips or Jamelia Lemieux, or people who do kind of, like I say, pop culture feminism.
Right.
You don't see that so much in the text, but again, like I said, you do see people like, I think to a certain extent, Bell Hooks and some other authors that lend themselves to be interpreted in that way. So the battle is largely ideological. How do we reformulate black men and the idea of racialized males? Because the same thing happens to brown men. Right? Same things happen to racially subserved or subjugated male populations across the world. So the question is, how do we reformulate how we understand black men within the structure of patriarchy, right? Within the structure of the ideological program of racial subjugation? And how do we understand the particular sexual violence, the rape, molestation, early child sexual abuse, etc., right? That black men and black women play a role in as constituting the personality or the traumatic effects that black men experience and live with for the rest of their lives. Those questions, I think, have to be answered. And I think the only way you're going to get to that is not working through existing theoretical apparatus, but to actually have a different way of doing it, which is like what black male studies.
Okay.